Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, as the case may be. I'm actually coming to you today from the Pacific Northwest, so we've got about an hour of morning left here on the West Coast. It's so fantastic to have you with us, as always. We're going to give it about 60 seconds before we kick into our conversation today, let everybody get connected, but definitely invite you during that time to jump into the chat. Let us know who you are and where you are watching from today, and we will be underway momentarily. Got to be a fast reader to keep up with this chat. All right, well, with that, why don't we go ahead and kick things off. It is fantastic to be with you as we kick off a brand new year of the Early Efforts web series from the Hunt Institute. My name is Dan Worry. I am the Senior Director of Early Learning at the Institute. And for those of you who may be joining us for the very first time today, the Hunt Institute is the creation and brainchild of Jim Hunt, who served 4 terms as the governor of North Carolina. We are an education policy support to the nation's governors and lawmakers based in Cary, North Carolina. The Institute covers the full education continuum from prenatal to post-secondary, but here on the Early Efforts web series, we focus on the earliest part of that continuum, the years of early childhood. We have a really special conversation today and an amazing panel to discuss a really important topic, which is preschool suspension and expulsion. And if that topic alone strikes you as an odd concept, I will tell you that you are not alone. In fact, I've been amazed since we announced this topic by the number of people who have said to me, either in person or through social media, preschool expulsion, is that even a thing? And so, the answer, sadly, is not only yes, but that it is much more common than you might imagine. And so we'll be unpacking that with the panel in just a moment. First, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. One is that we will dedicate a portion of the hour today to answering your questions and encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to enter any questions that you may have. Would distinguish that from the chat. As you saw already, the chat can move very quickly and have lots of comments in it. So if you can sort of tease out and use the Q&A function to ask questions specifically that you'd like to pose to the panel, then that'll help us to sort through those. The other thing that I do want to always mention is that we make this series available with closed captioning. And so if that is a service that would be beneficial to you, you can find the closed captioning controls also down in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And so with that, let's go ahead and jump into gear and introduce our panel today. We are excited to have Dr. Kate Zinsser, who is an associate professor of community and prevention research at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Zinsser is also the author of a new book on this very topic called No Longer Welcome, the epidemic of expulsion from early childhood education. Dr. Zinsser, we're glad to have you with us. Senator Cristina Pacione-Zayas of Illinois is with us as well. Senator, thank you for taking time to be with us. And we have 2 amazing colleagues from the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University. Dr. Chantel Meek is a professor of practice at the university and the founding executive director of the Children's Equity Project. And Dr. Tunette Powell is an assistant research professor and the director of K-12 education at the Equity Project. Panelists, thank you so much for being with us for this important conversation today. And Kate, maybe we begin with you. As I mentioned, you've kind of literally written the book on this topic. Help us set the stage for our conversation today. As I mentioned, it's this is a topic that actually strikes many as a surprise. They think, how a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old can be expelled from preschool. So maybe help us as we open up first, maybe with some definitions. What are we even talking about here when we talk about suspension and expulsion in preschool? And then, how prevalent is this practice? What does the data tell us about it?
Thanks, Dan. Thanks so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's a real honor to share the screen with these fabulous folks and to have a chance to talk about this really important issue with a wonderful community of co-learners here. Dan, you're asking some big questions. So what do we mean when we're talking about suspension and expulsion, especially in early childhood? In the broadest sense, we're talking about removing or excluding kids from early learning environments. This can be a temporary exclusion or suspension, which is a term that we've inherited from K-12 settings, which might look like sending a child home for part of a day or for a whole day, or asking a parent to keep a child home temporarily. Children also can be more formally or informally expelled. And formal expulsions will look a lot like what we see in elementary and high school, where a program informs a parent formally that their child has been disenrolled, that they're no longer welcome to come back to the program. And this could happen very suddenly. You might find out on Friday that you don't have childcare starting on Monday. But we also hear a lot of stories through my research with parents and with administrators and teachers around informal ways that children are excluded. Some other terms that might be more familiar are soft expulsions or push-outs. And these encompass times when a program might encourage a family to voluntarily stop attending a program or to remove their child. Parents report that they hear the term that a program's not a good fit for their child, or that the program can't meet their child's needs. Alternatively, we hear from families that programs might engage in practice that make it untenable for them to stay at a program, such as sending a child home repeatedly, multiple times during a week in the middle of the day, so a parent has to leave work and starts to be concerned about losing their job because of the loss of childcare. We also hear about kind of more severe instances where parents are told that if they want their child to stay, that the parents have to pay out of pocket for a one-on-one behavioral aid. So that's a way of making a parent kind of have their hand forced, where they have to choose to unenroll their child even though they wanted to stay at that childcare arrangement. So a couple big broad definitions there. Then you ask these two simple questions about why and how often, Dan. These are two other really big questions. So think about how often first. Honestly, it's hard to give you a hard number on this, in part because we don't have a clear coordinated data system that encompasses our whole childcare system or our early education system. So unlike what the Department of Education can do for our K-12 learning environments, we can't give you a direct estimate. But there are some good studies that have given us estimates. So for example, the National Survey of Children's Health was a representative sample of parents, and they reported that 50,000 children in preschool or childcare are suspended every year, and upwards of 17,000 are formally expelled. Taken together, this leads to an estimate of 250 kids for every school day of the year being asked to leave temporarily or fully, permanently from their childcare or preschool arrangement. And that doesn't even include the soft expulsions, and it doesn't encompass our full childcare system, so it doesn't count home-based childcare as well. Now, looking across studies, it's clear that exclusionary discipline like this is not rare. Instead, across multiple studies, we see between 25 and 50% of programs reporting excluding at least one kid every year, which means that many kindergarten classrooms are going to have kids in them who were asked to leave their prior schooling environment in some way. Briefly, you asked the question about why, Dan. Why are these practices still so prevalent? In the narrowest sense, exclusionary discipline is an adult's reaction to an unwanted pattern of child behaviors. From my own work with teachers and administrators, we've heard the full gamut of reasons why kids are asked to leave programs. We've heard stories of children throwing chairs, of teachers having their arms broken, of other children being bitten, and parents being scared. But we've also heard a lot of stories about kids being asked to leave because they cried too much, or because they didn't want to stay on their cot during nap time, or they had a hard time following the expectations that may have been developmentally inappropriate for that age group. So when I think about why, I really zoom out and think more broadly. And I conceptualize exclusionary discipline more as being a symptom of a much larger problem, of a childcare system and education system in our nation that's really underfunded, that's undervalued, that's at extreme levels of stress and distress. And when we ask, why are kids being expelled, it's important to consider the context in which those expulsion decisions are being made. So with regards to what resources teachers and programs have, what supports, the training, the compensation, the workplace climates, the relationships, it's a much bigger question than just behavior.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much. And I want to turn to Senator Pacione-Zayas. And Senator, you, as you know well, but maybe our audience does not, that you actually sort of wear two hats in this conversation, certainly as a policymaker, and later in the hour want to hear about how Illinois has sort of approached this from a policy perspective, but you also bring the perspective of an education expert as well. Prior to serving in office, you were the Associate Vice President at the Erickson Institute in Chicago, which is certainly known as one of the nation's premier child development graduate programs. So wanted to maybe pose to you first a question about sort of this question from the child's perspective, right? We know that, learning and developing social and emotional competence is something that is really a fundamental part of going to preschool, right? That this is really part of the curriculum. It's what we're hoping the children are going to become more proficient with. And so developmentally speaking, why is this practice of suspension and expulsion kind of at odds really with what we know about what early childhood education is supposed to accomplish?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be on this illustrious panel. I would like to just kind of, start with some of our fundamentals that, early experiences matter. What a young child experiences has the possibility to have a long-term impact over the human experience. And therefore, thinking about it from the standpoint of children learn in the context of relationships. And those relationships, whether it's with peers or whether it's with adults, really can have a long-lasting impact. And when we're talking about exclusionary discipline, it typically yields adverse outcomes in the short term. One, behavior is not remedied. We don't have research that actually shows that doesn't change the behavior and address the root cause. Two, these exclusionary practices have implications for social emotional development, right? Literally, the relationships being fractured, literally feeling as though I don't belong. I am not supposed to be here. I am inherently bad. It reinforces these messages that then can kind of carry over with the acting out. It also, has some implications for the cognitive development, right? When we have disruptions in your high quality early childhood care and education, we disrupt the continuity and the scaffolding of skill building, the stability of relationships with adults. And then, of course, there's a long-term consequence with the connection of early expulsion and then later academic outcomes. So in the school setting, when you're in a high quality setting, you are, not only learning kind of like the fundamentals of the cognitive and the academic, but the social emotional is key. The regulation of your behavior, self-regulation, the ability to mitigate conflict and take turns and executive functioning and impulse control. All of those are incredibly important and are built into a high quality system, and being put out literally, whether it's being separated or whether it's being excluded, it really then disrupts this development that is so necessary in the early years.
Absolutely. Want to remind you again, if you have questions for the panel, do please start plugging those into the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. And with that, Dr. Meek, I want to turn to you. We mentioned early on that you were the founding executive director of the Children's Equity Project, and one of the things that we've not delved much into in our conversation thus far is the fact that preschool suspension and expulsion, like expulsion elsewhere, is not applied equitably necessarily across the board. And so help us understand the data here. Which children are most impacted, and why do you think that may be the case?
Thanks, Dan, and it's great to be with you all today. Yeah, I think this is one of the main issues, right? Exclusionary discipline and harsh discipline is not applied evenly across groups. And what we find is that Black children are significantly more likely to be suspended and expelled. And that exists across age groups, across state, across type of discipline, across time. So, these data points haven't changed much over time. I think the most recent data out of the Department of Education on pre-K find that Black boys make up 18% of male preschool enrollment, but 41% suspensions, and Black girls, the disparity is even a little bit greater, with them making up 19% of the female preschool enrollment, but 53% of girls suspended at that age group. And so that is a consistent and stark finding that has existed, right? And we've known about it now for quite a long time. We also see that children with disabilities, especially Black children with disabilities, are also over suspended and expelled and disproportionately harshly disciplined across exclusionary discipline, but also across other forms of harsh discipline like seclusion, for example, that we haven't talked about much. And boys are much more likely to be suspended and expelled than girls. In terms of the why, right? I think Kate hit on some of these. The senator hit on some of these. I think the top thing that I want to really focus on is really the anti-Black kind of racism and implicit bias that we see in some of these places, right? Whenever I talk about the disparities that we see in suspension and expulsion, I think it's equally important to talk about the fact that there's no real credible data or research that finds that Black children actually behave worse, right? They don't engage in more frequent misbehavior. They don't engage in more severe misbehavior. Yet, we find this really kind of consistent finding that they are being suspended and expelled more. And there is a body of research that digs in to implicit bias and the various dimensions of that influence that, right? I think we generally point to challenging behavior, right, as being, right, a leading cause or main contributor to suspension expulsion. But it's really the perception of challenging behavior and for who we think it's particularly challenging for a behavior to occur and for who it's kind of we're more forgiving, right? And so, as I said, there's lots of literature on this more broadly, with some with young children, some with older children, that find that people perceive, for example, Black boys as older than they actually are, right? We've seen studies that find that there's increased scrutiny. So we're watching Black children more, and particularly Black boys more, when we're expecting challenging behavior. Dr. Walter Gilliam out of Yale, who has done a lot of work on this for years, has kind of identified 3 Bs that he talks about being risk factors for being suspended and expelled. And the 3 Bs are being Black, being a boy, and being big. So in a classroom with 3 and 4-year-olds, for example, the 4-year-olds were often taller. And when you pause, right, and think about that, right, what do those 3 Bs have to do with challenging behavior? They don't really have anything to do with challenging behavior. They have everything to do with how we're perceiving that challenging behavior. So that is one big bucket, I think, of work and of driving contributors to particularly the disparity that we see. And I think the second piece that Kate really referenced that I think we also need to underline is that this is a workforce that is undercompensated, underappreciated, overstressed, right? There has been research out of Yale recently and over the course of the pandemic that finds really high depression rates in early care and education providers. We see that we have high ratios and group sizes, right? I have a 3-year-old. And if you can imagine, if you know a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, right? Imagine having 11 of them for one person, right? So all of these different structural factors, the compensation, the stress, the group sizes, all of these expectations that we're putting on folks with very little support has to be, right, another piece of how we're looking at this puzzle. And the last thing I'll mention is policy, right? K-12 is a guaranteed public good that we know, right? It's required. Early education is not, obviously, is not universal or a guarantee. And so often the process of removing children from early childhood is less regulated, it's less looked at, it's more loose, it's more informal than it would be once you get to the K-12 system where school is required. And so in a lot of places we have no policy, so it's kind of on a, ad hoc basis. In other places we have bad policy, and in a lot of places we have policy kind of without the accompanying accountability and the company supports to really make that policy make sense. So I'll stop there.
Chantal, thank you so much. And Dr. Powell, I want to turn to you. I mentioned a moment ago that Senator Pacione Zayas wears different hats in this conversation, right? As a policymaker, but also in her professional work in education. And you also wear a couple of different hats that you have spoken about very publicly in this conversation, certainly professionally in your work at the Children's Equity Project, but you've also experienced this conversation as a parent, but also personally. Share a little bit of your story and how your experience, with your own experiences in preschool and as both a student and subsequently as a mother are helping to shape your work at the Children's Equity Project.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I just first want to lift up Black and Indigenous families and children who are not on this panel, who are experiencing this in the moment that we're talking about it. So I just want to start there. And I will say, to your point, I was expelled from preschool when I was 3 years old. And I remember my mother not really knowing what to do because it wasn't, something physical. It was this idea that she's acting too grown, right? That was always this label that was assigned to me. And I struggle at times because I survived the school to prison pipeline, right? And I struggle with that guilt of what that means and what that looks like. And so later on in my life, at a different very point in my life, I had children. I have 3 sons now. And I will tell you that in 2014, my oldest 2 sons were suspended when they were 3 and 4 years old. And they were suspended for about 12 times combined over the year of 2014. I will tell you some of the things that made my experience different and unique, which is why this work is important, that it was the same year that the U.S. Department of Education released data about preschool suspension and the disparities there. And so because of that, the experience was very different because I was able to talk about that, vocalize that in ways that are not always the case. And what ended up happening was after I talked and shared my own experience of having 2 sons suspended for a number of different reasons. None of them were extreme to me. None of them warranted suspension. And also suspension was not effective for a number of reasons. I can tell you one of those. I remember my 3-year-old, whose name is Joa. He was suspended one time. He had just turned 3 and he almost saw it as a great thing, right? I get to go home. I get to be with my mother. It was very much that way. And I think what you also have to realize when you have kids that are this young of an age, they may not always be able to understand exactly, right, what's happening, but the collective trauma amongst families and communities is so detrimental. And a lot of the work that I've done, I've worked with families across the United States. And I've learned this, that school teaches us who the good and bad parents are and who the good and bad students are. That's where that comes from. So I had a number of families who started to internalize the experience that they were having. I will also tell you that when my kids were suspended in 2014, white families were very vocal. I never forget being at a birthday party and a white parent telling me, Tanette, something is wrong. My kid did something worse and only got a phone call. And so I think that was kind of that reckoning moment for me, because no one wakes up and says, oh, this is the system. Oh, this is an issue of race and racism. No one thinks like that. Like, you're a parent, you're in the thick of it. You want your kids to go to school. You want them to do well. You want them to have a great experience. And when that's not the case, you're going to internalize that and start with yourself. What am I doing? What if I could have done better? You're going to be harder on your kids. And so I think for me, I went on that journey where, yes, I wanted to continue to think about who my kids were, how they showed up, but also had to think about the statistics that continue to show us of what is happening to Black boys in this educational system at every level, right? And it starts so early. And so I think that it's important for us to not only think about the individual experience of our children, but to think about the collective experience. I will tell you that for me, it is something that has never gone away. I have seen success, and so somebody could say, "Oh, it didn't matter; it was fine." But the level of trauma that I've had to work on, right, all of these years. I mean, still to enter a school feels a certain way for me. To receive a phone call, even though my kids are thriving, still feels a certain way to me. And I will tell you that that's been the case in all of the studies that I've done with families from around the country. That I had a family, this is the last thing I'll say, I had a family, a mother that I was interviewing. It had been 25 years since her son was suspended, and it still felt like yesterday. The tears, right? Her son did not escape the school to prison pipeline. The guilt that you feel from not being able to advocate for your child, it is very, very real. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. Let me throw this out to all of you. We've talked about a couple of different things. We've certainly talked about implicit bias. We've talked about challenging behaviors. We know that developmentally the idea of excluding young children from preschool programs from the child's perspective is not a beneficial thing. But we also know that we have a teacher problem here, right? And so, and I'll throw this out to all of you, but maybe Kate, maybe you can jump in to start here. What do teachers need to be able to meaningfully do away with this practice? Because ultimately, and we'll talk about sort of how, again, Illinois is a great example of a state that has enacted policy around this, but it's not enough, right, to just tell teachers, well, no, you can't do this. They are in some cases struggling with, some very challenging behaviors that may be disruptive, that may be ultimately unsafe if they're not, handled appropriately. But part of that relates to the professional development of teachers and their understanding of what is, in fact, normal for infants and toddlers and young preschoolers. What sort of systems are key in your mind, Kate, in terms of helping to mitigate against this practice?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks, Dr. Powell, for sharing your story. It's this whole topic brings up so much empathy on all sides of, because there's not an individual source point that we can point to and say, if we just fix this, everything will get better. But I think, Dan, you're bringing up a good point, that a place to start is to think about how we are describing the work of early educators and how we're compensating the work of early educators as a true skilled profession. Our country is backed into treating caregiving as an afterthought and as an unskilled source of labor, when in fact a community-based preschool teacher's job is so much harder than my job in higher education, and they will have so much of a larger impact on the lives of young learners than I ever will have with my undergraduate or graduate students. So to kind of really flip the scales in the way we conceptualize and compensate and value our education professionals, starting at birth, because those first 5 years we know are neurologically the most valuable and highest growth years in a child's life. But that's not something you can just with the stroke of a pen fix. I mean, maybe, Senator, you can work on that, but I think it's going to be a tough road. And so some things that we've looked at in the research is, what are the in-classroom ratios? How busy is that room, and how much stress? If you think about, teachers are engaged in kind of cognitive air traffic control work all day long. The more bodies that are in the room, the more chaos there is to manage. So not just adding more adults, but literally bringing down the total number of humans in the room reduces the burden cognitively on educators. And it means that they can form much more substantial, real relationships with kids, which helps them anticipate children's needs, helps them anticipate crunch points where there's going to be a hard transition for this child, but not for that child. It gives them more cognitive bandwidth to be able to anticipate and problem solve in real time. But a bigger issue is that 50% of our early childhood education workforce qualifies for some form of public assistance. They're getting paid abysmal wages, and they rarely get health insurance. Retirement savings is almost unheard of. And so they're living paycheck to paycheck and often needing some kind of additional financial support. And you're bringing that level of financial stress to work with you, which means you step into the classroom. My mother was an early educator, and thankfully we were financially stable, but she brought into her classroom whatever stress we had piled on her in the morning, right? The stress of being a mom, the stress of living in a busy world, the stress of commuting, all of that comes to school with teachers too. And so they, as emotional humans, are having to grapple with, how do I regulate how I'm feeling? How do my feelings impact the way I respond to kids' behavior or perceive kids' behavior? And the financial stress and the workplace stress is going to really accentuate their ability to respond in a developmentally appropriate, supportive, and affirming way to kids' feelings and behaviors.
Well, and all of those stressors that you mentioned, this is a data point that is probably, much like the suspension and expulsion data that you were mentioning, that we don't have a great handle on at a national level because, a unified data system doesn't exist. But we have seen estimates that, upward of 40% even of the early childhood workforce in childcare settings turns over every year in the classroom. And so, at precisely the time that we need young children to have continuity of care and stable, nurturing, well trained teachers, instead what we are providing in practice is this sort of revolving door of poorly equipped teachers in some cases that may just really not have the background to and the training to deal with some of these things. Jeanette, I want to turn to you on this question. What else do we need? What how do we prevent this?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things, and I have said this before, and I will quote Lil Kim. I think money, power, respect is very, very important. I think that for sure, like, we know that wages are an issue, right? That if I'm not being paid, I'm already stressed out. I can't afford to live, work, and play in the city that I'm in. Like, yes, I'm overstressed. I think this power piece is important to me because I think educators and parents, like, we can see some similarities, the power in the knowledge and in the resources that we have. And so for me, whatever skills I have as a parent, that's what I'm going to use to try to, rear my child the best way I know how. Same is the same for teachers. When my kids were suspended from school when they were 3 and 4, I never forget when the news became national, the preschool teachers reached out to me and they started meeting at my house on weekends. And they talked about the lack of training. They knew CPR, but they didn't know many other things, right? Like, they talked about that. Like, what else can we have? If I'm playing cards and I'm playing a game of spades and all I have is one spade, I'm just going to use that one spade. But if I know I have a hand of things to say, okay, in addition to kicking a kid out, here's a strategy, here's a tool, here are the things that I can do, we are not giving them a hand in which they can win. So I think we need to change that for educators, for sure. That needs to be at the top of it. I think the respect piece goes with the wages as well, but I also think respect is being in the room, right? Being part of decision-making processes. How many times do we have policies and different processes that come in place where we haven't consulted with the experts on the ground? That is also true for families. And so I really do believe that, if you are doing work with Indigenous kids, with Black kids, with brown kids, with any group of kids, and if you don't have that representation in the room, I feel like that's a lack of respect, right? It's a lack of dignity. And I don't feel we move forward without some of those things. But I definitely think that the one thing I would hope that people wouldn't do, we cannot pit educators and parents against each other. I think that division is how we continue to move forward and keep the status quo. I think that it's time for us to have all of those groups at the table, really a part of decision-making processes. But I think for sure, like, the more resources you have, the more you know, the easier it is to take suspension off of the table. And I don't think that we've reached that place where we've given people what they need to be able to do something different.
I want to turn in just a minute to talk about some of the policy solutions that states are enacting. But Chantal, anything you want to add on this question?
Yeah, sure. So we actually published a report on this issue and on really thinking about a holistic approach to ending exclusionary discipline for kids a couple months ago, and we can share that in the chat. It includes a lot of the things that we've already talked about, but just briefly, I'll say policy and accountability that's tied to the policy, professional development, preparation, classroom climate and flow. So are the things we're engaging in with kids developmentally appropriate? Are behavioral expectations developmentally appropriate or not, right? Like, all of the different things that we expect of kids that are just inappropriate for their stage and age and the flow of what the day should look like. Teacher compensation and working conditions, including those group sizes and ratios. universal screening, developmental and behavioral screening to identify kids who need extra support and get them that proactive, right, support early, linkages to early intervention and special ed, mental health supports where that's needed, infant and early childhood mental health consultation, which is a model that's pretty widely scaled across the country, but not fully accessible to everybody. Strong family partnerships, as Dr. Powell was just mentioning, data systems and feedback loops, right? We're really operating kind of blind on this in a lot of parts of the system because one, this issue is pretty informal in a lot of places, so we don't collect data on it. And two, there's just, for example, in childcare, right? There's not like a national data system where we can look at what this is looking like. And so really kind of putting into place those data systems and not just looking at the aggregate again, because this isn't evenly applied, right? Always at the program level, at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, disaggregating that data to identify where there are disparities happening to address those. And then finally, the whole family wellness, right? Kids grow up in the context of their families, in the context of their communities, and what support does the whole family need, right? To make sure that that's right, a positive environment and good partnerships with schools. So all in there.
All right, well, so many questions stacking up in the Q&A. We're going to jump to them in just a minute. But Senator, before we do that, I want to ask you, Illinois is, as I mentioned, an example of a state that has actually taken action in law to prohibit this practice. Talk to us a little bit about what the case is there in Illinois and what the state has learned in the process.
Yeah, I mean, it actually is a nice follow-up to what Chantal was just laying out in terms of how it came about here. Public Act 100-105 was signed into law in August of 2017. This had been after some kind of socialization and, of course, looking at some studies and data that are related to the, disproportionate impact, particularly as it relates to Black boys, to children of color, but then also taking into consideration these pieces around workforce and support. It's not just enough to prohibit, right? We need to build capacity and provide the resources and allocate the actual dollars. I love that power money piece. And so, with our act, our goals were to basically ensure that our providers were engaging in best practices with disciplinary approaches that prohibit expulsion of young children due to child behaviors. So that's the prohibition piece, right? The second piece speaks to the capacity building. And, that's connecting our providers to existing available resources and supports to address the needs of children. And in the case of Illinois, we really have done some expansion and investments around our infant early childhood mental health consultation model, the pyramid model for social emotional competency building. And then, at the elementary level, that our elementary schools have also preschools in them as well, the resilience in education and community healing work that is coming out of our Illinois State Board of Education. But then the last piece that, had been alluded to earlier is accountability, right? So ensuring that if there is a transition, because if there is a planned transition and there's, certain components that need to be met, and the evidence demonstrated with the documentation and, of course, the involvement of families in all of this process, you then, have a mechanism to determine that a placement elsewhere may just be better for the child, for the family. But what we require is the tracking of those transitions that is, due to the behavior. And that's going to help us with providing data and monitoring the trends so that we can intervene with resources as necessary as this is kind of rolling out.
Senator, thank you. I'm gonna jump into to the questions here from the viewing audience. And Kate, let me pose this to you because you sort of raised this earlier on, and maybe going to combine a couple of questions that I'm seeing here in the chat. One question is around the data here. I mean, it seems to me like maybe moving forward towards solving this as an issue would benefit from actually having more accurate data on just how prevalent something like this is. So, question one maybe is, what as a researcher researcher in this area, what sort of recommendations would you make maybe to policymakers who are watching? And then Larry has an interesting question that we might not have an answer to, but I want to throw out because I think it's a data question as well. He's asking, is there a correlation between income level and expulsion and suspension? And in particular, I think what he's asking here, he's saying, I wonder if programs are less likely to expel children whose families are paying full fee. And so a question of, if we're looking at a child maybe who's receiving a subsidy, who may, the state may be paying a fractional portion of what the market rate is versus a more affluent family potentially that is paying that full market rate. Do you have any indication there?
I'm going to take those. Thanks, Dan, and interesting question. So I think as a researcher, I'm 100% biased that I will always want more and better data, right? So I'm just going to own that right off the bat. I think that the challenge with asking for better data or more data is twofold. One, sometimes we get stuck in the thread of just worshiping the problem and focus on collecting the data without actively doing anything with the information we get. And to your point, Dr. Powell, about making sure that we are closing the loop and making sure that everybody is part of the conversation about how we proceed and what the solutions are we move forward with. And if data is coming at the expense of forming those relationships and collaborations, then it's not going to be helpful. At the same time, we're going to have a significant data literacy problem as we move forward to asking our early educators to put on yet another hat, right? So we've already asked them to be health and safety monitors and educators and social workers in many instances and mental health providers. And now we're going to ask them to be data enterers and accurate reporters. And there's a lot of paperwork that goes into creating, tracking, and managing these transitional support plans and what constitutes a forced versus informal expulsion, and how do they know when to categorize what as what, and how vulnerable do they feel safe being, right? Depending on what the accountability systems are within a system, is it going to be to their benefit as an independent operator, as a business owner, to lay the cards out on the table? And is it a carrot or is it a stick that's getting them to accurately report what's happening in their program? And so I think to the extent that data collection and data reporting can support everybody in recognizing that this is a systems-wide crisis and not placing blame or trying to call out individual quote unquote bad apples. And so I'm wary about as much as I want more data, I'm wary about how we would roll out a process of collecting more data. We've also seen in our convenience sample surveys here in Illinois about administrators clearly making a choice about when to omit data when they're filling out our surveys, right? So reporting that they've engaged in several exclusionary discipline practices and giving us age and gender data and then skipping all the race and ethnicity questions. So there's a self-awareness that something bad is happening here and I'm not comfortable engaging in the process of reflecting on it and moving on to the other questions that are more comfortable. And so if we start collecting incomplete data, it's only going to probably make our jobs harder and make it harder for us to act in solving the problem. Larry's question about fee for service and parent income. There had been a question earlier about I dropped a link in the Q&A for reference to the article from the National Children's Health Survey that did include as one of the predictors of expulsion risks or odds as families' income, or I guess the adverse childhood experiences of having unstable housing and low income in early childhood. I believe that in that study, they were finding that any one of those adverse childhood experiences increase the risk of expulsion. And I'd have to go back and actually get into the tables to look at the direct odds ratios associated with low income family status during early childhood. That being said, I think that we need to think about these not just as individual risk factors and as the interaction of lived experiences of kids and families, and how it's not just whether or not you're coming from a household that is food insecure or housing insecure, but the way that those in coordination affect how you come to school and how your family is privileged or not privileged in their interactions with the childcare system. I can only share to that specific question about like childcare vouchers versus paying full tuition. I know in our convenience sample Illinois surveys, we actually saw the data flip, where in one of our early years of the survey, we saw that parents paying programs that were entirely tuition funded by parents, so all private pay programs, had higher rates of expulsion in the first year of our survey. But 2 years later, it was programs that were partially publicly funded that had higher rates. And our only understanding of that, the one hypothesis we had, was that it was around the delay in reimbursement for service for kids who are receiving childcare assistance vouchers. That if you expelled a kid in the middle of the month, you might still get paid the full voucher. And that's still a very gray area. So I don't want to put a whole lot of weight on that. But I'm trying to understand why in some instances there might be higher rates among private pay programs versus higher rates among partially or fully publicly funded programs.
We have, again, a bumper crop of questions here in the chat and about 15 minutes left. I'm going to go to one. Catherine has a really intriguing question that I think is a good one for each of you, actually. So would love to have each of you weigh in, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end maybe for a couple more. But if we don't, this is a great way to sort of frame up the remainder of the hour. She's saying, say that the four of you as panelists could be in charge of redesigning preschool. What would children's experiences look like? What would be different about the physical setting? Are there particular standards that are important, things that need to be changed, need to be dropped? So take a moment to envision a more ideal way of looking at this problem, because I think this is a great way for us to start thinking towards solutions here. Jeanette, is there anything that jumps out at you off, just right off the top of your head? If you were queen for a day and could redesign the system, what would it look like to make sure that the experience maybe that you had, that your sons had, is not the experience that other children will experience?
Yeah, and I was looking directly at Chantel for this. We've been, reimagining school at multiple levels. So this is something that is near and dear to my heart. We obviously don't think that we would, live in a society where 250 kids are suspended from preschool every day. But I think play is a word that would be at the root of it, right? That I think we would interrogate readiness and what that means. I think that has done more harm than we can imagine in certain communities, surely in tribal communities. And so I think that it would be important for us to interrogate that. What are we getting kids ready for? Why is there this rush? How does that also contribute to the stress that educators feel? And how do we have spaces that are really just play-based? Right? We've been talking about some of these things, Chantel and I, in conversation around when you go to a children's museum, for an example, you can touch everything. But in schools, you can't, right? I watch how buildings look, right? My kid went to early childhood facilities where on the outside, you would never believe that was a place for kids. I grew up with a father who was incarcerated. So the schools are looking more like prisons than ever before. And so I think that we would obviously design buildings that looked like museums, that were fun places for kids to go to. And we would get back more to play. I want to give time for everybody else to answer, but I think play at the root of it. Obviously, the educators will be paid more. They will be trained in ways that really valued who they were. Families would be at the forefront, where we would have more community-based, not community in the sense of how we talk about it in schools, but actually, what are the ways of being in those communities that, and how can schools embody that? So I'll let others answer. I don't want to take over, but I love this question.
Chantel, let me tag to you.
Yeah, as Dr. Powell mentioned, we've actually been working on a project that we're calling like the ideal elementary school in early years and early grades, and thinking about all these dimensions. So yeah, I think play, the pedagogy, what we're actually doing with kids in the time that we have them, right? Is it developmentally appropriate? Is it play-based? Or are we putting unrealistic expectation and behavioral expectations on kids? I think development, play, pedagogy, all of that is part of it. I think that the bias, right, awareness, the culturally responsive and sustaining education piece, understanding all of those pieces, because today in the United States, children of color are a majority of children in this country, and the younger you get, the more diverse kids are. And so to not right, really be basing our instruction, our pedagogy on, right, being culturally responsive is just doing a disservice nationally to all of us across the board. And then I think the third piece I would just mention is mental health, right, and the school climate. And I know people have made some comments related to COVID and kind of the challenging behavior and screen time and all these different things. But really, how are we fostering mental health of the provider, of the family, of the child, of everybody in the child atmosphere here? And the last thing is all of the workforce things that we've already talked about, right? A respected, supported, fairly compensated workforce that has a manageable number of children to actually engage in that adult-child interaction that we know is foundational to children's development and outcomes.
Senator, let me turn to you next. Sort of the same question about how might you approach this question if you were in charge of redesign, but maybe for you in your case tack on an extra question around what are you hearing in this conversation today that maybe policymakers around the country need to be tuned into, and where do you see an opportunity for state legislatures, for governors to step in and help structurally to make sure that these things are in force in the states?
Well, I mean, I would say like the themes that just came out of the, most recent kind of freedom dreaming is that, this work is child and relationship centered. And we need a radical reimagination of what schooling is, period. Because in many ways, historically, it's been about control. And it's been about domestication. And it's not really been anchored in sort of a decolonial process or a decolonizing process. I'm a student of Paulo Freire. For me, education is an act of liberation and freedom. So how do we manifest that, operationalize that in our practices, in our policies, all the way from the very early years in a formalized setting. I think too, going back to the relationships piece, are our environments and are our resources encouraging responsive and warm relationships, humane interactions? In many ways, our schools are really struggling to exemplify that, because of what we're being asked to be monitored or up against, the limitation of the resources. And so, when I was sitting on the State Board of Education, one of the first things that I said in my first meeting, I said, look, y'all, we need to, develop a decolonization plan when we're looking at our school system. People were like, what, huh? So, and, because and this was obviously pre-pandemic. And I think even more so, we have to look at that. And so I really +1 everything that folks have said, but I think the only thing I would also add is thinking about, because I'm also a fan of the Reggio Emilia approach about, child-led and being connected to nature and a natural born kind of scientist. And I think more and more as we're thinking about climate change and how we need to take care of our earth, I think that that's going to be incredibly important with these next generations, that it becomes sort of second nature. And then one last thing, I think too, what COVID presented us with is really an attention and awareness of how we need to think about public health. And it's not just an it is the collective health. And so when we, do certain practices, it is to protect the community health. And so I just kind of, want to emphasize that, and I'd love to partner with y'all. Let's get our Freedom Dreaming preschool going.
Senator, thank you. Kate, you've probably had more time to think on this particular question, having written a book length description of this at this point. If we made you ruler of early childhood for the day, how would you re-envision the system?
Oh, goodness. Wow. I mean, I had to write, my editor made me put a very clear statement in the opening that there will be no solutions articulated at the end of the book, because this is the start of an ongoing conversation. And I think the first thing I would do is make sure that at the table, having these wonderful dreamy thoughts are all these brilliant people and so many of the folks in our chat, because there's some wonderful ideas flying through. I think I keep coming back to the adage that you cannot educate a child without caring for them, and you can't care for a child without educating them. That the two go hand in hand. And likewise, as in order to foster those care and education processes, we have to care for and educate our professionals. My other hat that I wear here at the university is thinking about how we are creating a pipeline and a pathway for early educators that at its core is about social emotional development. And that includes the teacher's own social emotional well-being. And so starting our teacher professional pipeline with joy, with love, with play, and with a focus on who are they as emotional beings and social beings stepping into the classroom, and what do they bring as some of the best role models that those kids will have about how to be socially and emotionally healthy and interacting and creating peers. And so thinking about the way we've centered teacher preparation to be about restrictions and control and adult-led and pedagogy and content focused, instead of about bringing out the natural developmental process and accentuating the skills that these kids are naturally developing, and being there as a partner in their learning, as a guide, not as a director. And so how do we reimagine that teacher pipeline so that it is about joy and love and play, and that it's not a finite process? You don't become a teacher in a 2-year program and get handed a piece of paper and then automatically know what to do in every situation for every type of kid, right? Needing to think about how do we create a dynamic, culturally responsive, and respectful workforce that can step into and partner with families across a wide array of settings and continue to be curious and learn and have access to the resources they need to keep growing as professionals, because they are professionals, and we need to keep saying that. I feel like I've been reading papers that were published 50 years ago that say that, but I'm just going to keep saying it over and over again. And we don't expect a CEO of a large corporation to be done learning about their business just because they got to the top of their game. It's a constant learning process. So creating a system that supports that and respects that process.
Okay, thank you. And I love, that was a fantastic question. And I love just the giving each of you the opportunity to think about that. I want to close out maybe with one and let you all comment on this, because this, this gets back to a tough question. And I don't want to downplay the fact that this is a tough question. There's an attendee who says, as an administrator, I hate to expel a child and rarely get to that point. But when I'm faced with aggressive behaviors like extreme, ongoing, unpredictable violence against other children or my teaching staff in a classroom with 15 plus children, am I not obligated to protect the majority and my teaching staff? I'm gonna weigh in with a little bit of an answer, and then would invite you all to have some short answers as well here, just in the last minute or two as we go. But I think this highlights the challenge in this whole topic, because I think I had a lot of interesting response from teachers who for whom the reaction was, what do you expect me to do? How am I going to deal with this? And I think, to me, the theme of this conversation that we've had over the past hour is that this is going to take something much more than the reality right now, right? That we need to think about this from a structural standpoint, from a professional development standpoint, from a resource standpoint, and I think one of the things, what I would say to this particular administrator is, yes, that is a challenge, and that it is incumbent on all of us to get involved in this conversation, because it's also not okay that the solution is just excluding individual children from the opportunity to have an early childhood education. And frankly, as an administrator, sort of wearing a former administrator's hat as well, we are setting ourselves up in the case of children like that for even greater problems potentially down the line, right? Taking a child who may really need support and opportunity to grow from a social emotional perspective, and excluding them from opportunities to do that, is liable to create even bigger problems as they get into K-12. So let me throw that open to any of you. Tunette, I don't know if you have thoughts on that particular
I'll
question.
be as brief as I can.
Yep.
I just want to say a couple of things. I think it's related, what I've been seeing in the chat about the role that parents play in some of the push out conversations. And I want to say I do a lot of work with families. That is like at the forefront of everything that I do. And we also need to be mindful that we've all been nurtured in a society of exclusion, right? So they're going to fall back to what they know as well. This child hit my child, I want them kicked out. And so the work with families has to be to acknowledge that and address that. And I'm going to tell you the same thing that I always tell families as well, is that if this was your child, and I have multiple children, if you are in a home and you have a child that has hit another child or done something else, you will not simply kick that child out. You have to think about how you're going to continue to have a household with multiple children and for that to be a thriving environment. And so I ask that same question. I will pose that to my families, that when we come here, kids are going to be learning, they're going to be growing, they're going to test boundaries, right? At some point, a child and another child are going to have a moment that where they didn't want to share or it wasn't their best day. And in the same way you would do in your household, we want to show young people how we recover from that, how we come back from that, how we love on each other, how we are, how we learn what accountability looks like at our small ages. But kicking them out as a parent is never an option for me. I say the same thing in a school space. And so I want us to think with that question. That doesn't solve it, doesn't make it easy for you, but I think it's incredibly important for us to remember that there are contexts where we don't simply kick kids out. And we need to think about some of those contexts and invite those into this conversation.
With the caveat that we are really just about at time, I want to give the rest of you an opportunity. Any brief response?
I would just say real quick, sometimes we conflate the extreme with the developmentally appropriate. Throwing a shoe, like these are examples I've heard, throwing a shoe, throwing a toy, kicking, hit, like these are all things, if you have a kid, if you know a kid, especially this age, like they are going to engage in those types of behaviors, and that is developmentally appropriate. We need to be trained and supported to be able to figure out those in an inclusive environment. When it comes to like the actual severe, hurt that you mentioned in this question, right? Then I bring in, that's where screening, right? Referral comes into place, plan transitions if they need to happen, right? Bringing in the family, like there's a holistic set of supports, including mental health supports and whatever else needs to happen to support that child, ideally inclusively within their program. I'll stop there.
Senator, any final thoughts?
No, I think that everybody has captured it beautifully, and I thank you once again for bringing us together, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Kate, I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, same. I know we're out of time, so thank you everybody for the wonderful questions. This has been tremendous.
Well, it has been a tremendous conversation. I knew it was going to be. I want to take a moment and thank our panel today, Dr. Kate Zinsser, Associate Professor of Community and Prevention Research at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Kate's new book is No Longer Welcome, The Epidemic of Expulsion from Early Childhood Education. You can find it on Amazon. Search No Longer Welcome. Senator Christina Pacione-Zayas of Illinois. Senator, thank you for taking time out. I think not everyone knows Senator has stepped out of the chamber and has legislative work that is happening all around her. So we're especially appreciative of your time today. Dr. Chantel Meek, the founding executive director of the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University, and Dr. Tunat Powell. Tunat, I can't thank you enough for your willingness to share your personal stories. It helps to really illuminate this topic in a very special way, and just really appreciative of your participation, both as a professional on this panel, but also as an individual and as a mother who's dealt with this. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing all of you again soon. We will be back in February. We're going to be talking about equitable birth outcomes. Speaking of a topic where there are some equity challenges, not all children's births are happening in healthy ways, and that is someplace that we are seeing disparities around the country. So we've got a great panel coming up in February to talk about equitable birth outcomes. In March, we'll be talking about the development of literacy. That literacy is not something that begins in second grade prior to taking a standardized test for the first time, that it is something that is beginning really from day one, even prenatally in some cases. So looking forward to a great panel on that in March as well. Again, thanks to our panel, but to all of you as well for taking time out of your busy days to join us today. We look forward to seeing you next time. And again, thanks so much.